So our daf for today is Tzadi Zayin. We'll start with the Mishnah on the bottom of Tzadi Vav Amid Beis. And the subject, just for background, is what's called Marika Ushtifa, which is a sugya that the Gemara has been addressing for a while now. And that means that after you cook the meat of the carbon in a kli. And now the kli has absorbed the taste of that carbon, so now you have to do what's called mariko shtifa. Marika means something that you do inside the kli, and shtifa is something you do to the outside of the kli. And the Mishnah first records a machlokas between Rabbi Tarfon and Chachamim. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Bishel mitchilas haregel, yevashel bo kol haregel. According to Rabbi Tarfon, you have 7 days of Yontif. When you cook the meat of the carbon on the first day, there's no need and no obligation to do Mariko Shtifa until you reach the finale at the end of the 7 days. Chachamim omrim ad zman achila. The Chachamim say no. We're not going to delay Mariko Shtifa as if you're not obligated until the end of the 7 days of Yontif. No. As soon as you're ready to eat from that kli, then you have a problem because the kli absorbed the carbon, and you have to get rid of that absorption, that blia that's within the kli, and mariko shtifa is part of the process of getting rid of that blia. And therefore, you can't use the kli multiple times during the course of Yontif. And just to clarify, or shall we say, expand this idea, the Chachamim are apparently worried about something called nosar, because nosar means after the allotment of the time. Now, if you have the blia, the absorption of the flavor inside the walls of the kli, then after the allotted time, it's going to become nosar. So how can you possibly use the kli again without subjecting it to mariko shtifa to get rid of all that blia? So waiting until the after Yontif, as Rabbi Tarfon insists, makes no sense according to the scorecard of the Chachamim. Now the Mishnah wants to tell me what is Marika and Shtifa. Marika ushtifa, Marika b'Marika sakos, ushtifa b'Shtifa sakos. So Rashi explains that the word kos here is a reference to a sugya in Brachos, I believe it's on Daf Nun, regarding koshel bracha. And the halacha is that a koshel bracha, like for example Birkas Hamazon, requires marika ushtifa. So that's the use of the word kos here in this context, in this Mishnah. And what does it mean when it says marika sakos and then it says shtifa sakos? The answer is that marika sakos means to purge it on the inside, where shtifa sakos means to rinse it out on the outside. And the Mishnah goes on to say that mariko shtifa bitzonein, that both marika and shtifa are done with cold water. Now this is machlokas tanoim, and according to one opinion in the tanoim, the marika has to be done with hot water, not cold water. Because again, the purging of the inside is to get that tam out. To get the tam balua out, you need hot water. Like, for example, hagola, you put the kli into hot water. This Mishnah reflects the shita of those tanoim that maintain that apparently in addition to getting rid of the blia, there's another Torah requirement, a mitzvah of Mariko Shtifa, and that's bitzonein. And that's, so to speak, a gzeres hakos of a separate entity unto itself, not to be confused with hagola and hechsher kelim and the like. And now we begin the daf that we want to study today, and that's daf Tzadi Zayin. The Mishnah continues, hashpud. Now a shpud is what we call in English a spit. It means it's a metal rod that you use for barbecuing, like a rotisserie. I remember my mother, she used to do this, to take a chicken and barbecue it. You put a shpud through it, and that's made of metal. And then there's an askala. The Askala is in Hebrew, it's called a reshet. Let's see how do you translate that into English. Um, can you help me out here, Ira? A reshet
Is
means, like tic-tac-toes, a grid, I think you'd call it in English. Does that make sense?
a grid?
Not a grid. What do you call it when you put meat on something and you put that something on the fire, and in the process of barbecuing, of roasting, the juices go in between these,
Oh, I don't know, just like a pan or something like that
yeah,
beneath.
but a pan is usually solid, so that's why I wanted to call it a grill. Anyway, um,
Okay.
Magi'ilon b'chamin. Now, the meat of the basar kodesh is now being absorbed by these metal kalim. And therefore, the Mishnah's language is very difficult. Magilam bechamin, it means you put them into hot water. We know that that's not so. The Torah says kibolakach polto, and in the parsha of Milchemes Midjan, at the end of Bamidbar, the Torah tells us that something called Shardover Asher Yovo Ba'esh Tovo Ba'esh, which means you do limun. And yet the Mishnah seems to assume in the cases of Shpud and Askela that all you need is Hagola Bechamin. That doesn't make any sense. So we'll see if we can resolve that problem. In any event, the Gemara says, "My time of the Rabbi Tarfon." What is the scriptural basis for Rabbi Tarfon's ruling that you can use the kli multiple times without Marik and Shtif until the end of Yontif? The Omakra, the pasuk says, "Ufanisa baboker." So it means at the end of Yontif, you vacate the environments of the Beis Hamikdash of Yerushalayim. You go home, and v'alachalochlecha, you go home. Hakasav ason kulam boker echad. Baboker, which usually in the singular refers to one particular morning, is quite obviously in this context referring to the entire Shivas Yomim of the Moed. And the Torah is collapsing, or shall we say, integrating all 7 days of the Moed into one Boker. And what is the halacha of Mariko Shtifa? The halacha of Mariko Shtifa only applies at the end of the day. Like, for example, the Chacham and Rabbi Tarful will say at the end of the day, you do Marika Shtifa, but according to Rabbi Tarfon, the day extends to incorporate all 7 days. So you're going to do the Marika Shtifa at the end of the Moed. Maskif lo Rav Achad Boy Bar Ami v'chi ein pigul beregel ein nosa beregel. I don't get it. How could you possibly use the kli multiple times, according to Rabbi Tarfon, during the course of the regel? After all, the kli has an absorption of the time of the basar kodesh, which after its allotted time, be it one day in the case of kodesh kodshim, chatas and osham, be it 2 days in the case of a carbon shlomim, kodesh kalim, but nevertheless, after that time period, the blia becomes nosar. And not only that, but chutz lizmano is pigul. So how can you tell me that you're going to reuse the kli when now the time of the basa that's absorbed in the kli is nosar or pigul? That's impossible. And v'chi tema hachinami, maybe Rabbi Tarfon holds that the entire Isser of Pigul, of Chutz's Mano and No Saliach's Mano, is extended by the Torah till after the Moed. That means even though you can no longer eat the carbon, it doesn't become Nosar until 7 days down the line. That's impossible. Well, Asani, we learned in the Bryce, Rabbi Nosson Omer, Lo Omer Rabbi Tarfon Ela Zu Bilvad. All Rabbi Tarfon is referring to is the mitzvah of Mariko Shtifa. He's not referring to Nosar and Pigul. Those Isurim, which generate a Chiv Kares, are applicable and validated from the minute you pass a certain time period. You can't say, let's wait for it to become Nosar until the end of the 7 days of Moadim. Elo kid Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Barvua, the Amar Rav Nachman, Kol Yom V'Yom Nasa Giul Lechavero. This is a fascinating concept. The Gemara is introducing a new concept here. That let's say on Yom Rishon, of Yantif, you cook the meat of the korban in a kli, and then let's say it's shlamim, and on Yom Sheni you will cook. Oh, forget about shlamim. I'm sorry. Cross that out. And on Yom Sheni, the following day, you cook a different korban, whether it be kachim kalam, kachim doesn't make any difference. But now what happens is when you cook the second day, Rabbi Tarfa maintains that that cooking is going to take the blia that's balua, that's absorbed in the walls of the kli, and it's going to spit it forth. It's going to be polate. Because you're subjecting the kli to a process of bishul. So therefore, as far as nosar or pigel or any of the like in the balua, we don't have to worry about that because tomorrow's carbon will completely eradicate that entire blia of pigel or nosar. But there's a separate mitzvah the Torah obligated us called Mariku Shtifa, and that, according to Rabbi Tarfon, will only apply at the end of the week after the Moed because the Torah made it all days of Moed into one single entity, one day. The Chacham Omer man zman achila. So the Gemara asks, "My come, what does it mean ad zman achila?" Rav Nachman or Rav Avo. Mamtin lo ad zman achila v'hadar ovid le marika ushtia. Every carbon has its allotted time. So let's say, for example, in the case of a chatos, you'll wait a day, and now the day has passed. Now's the time to do mariko shtifa. Or, for example, in Shlom, you wait 2 days, and now after the 2-day period, you do mariko shtifa. Here, my friends, we have a gigantic machlokas with Torah coming from here to the end of the Golos here. What's going on over here? Are we talking after it became Nosar, and then we're going to do Mariko Shtifa? Or are we going to do Mariko Shtifa right before the termination of the Zman Achil, before it becomes Nosar? And the sparks are flying here in every direction. But be that as it may, let's take the easy way out, the high road, and say that it became Nosar, and now we have to purge it of the time of Nosa before we cook in it again, and therefore we do Mariko Shtifa. Minani Mili, how do the Chacham derive from Scripture this conclusion? That when we get to the end of the Zman Achila, which is tomorrow, or the day after, in the case of Shlomo, that's when we're obligated to Mariko Shtifa, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Abi Yossi ben Abba Ksiv, Umarak Vishutav. We now go back to the original pasuk, in which the Torah commands us in Vayikra Perek Vav to the mitzvah Mariko Shtifa. And there it says, Ukli Cheres asher tevushal bo yishaver v'im b'kli nechoshes busholu marak v'shutav abayim. So we're not talking about a Kli Cheres which requires Shvira, but rather Kli Nechoshes, which requires Mariko Shtifa. Ksiv kol zachar bakonim yochal. Now that's in the very, very next pasuk there, Vayikra Vav, and commands us that the male Kohanim will eat from what? That's what we don't know. Haketzad, I don't get it. You know, in the Mitten Teridin, all of a sudden, after telling me about Mariko Shtifa, then you tell me about the male Kohanim that eat it. What's going on? So the Gemara answers, HaKetzad, what is the Torah teaching us? With this smichos ha-psukim, Mamtin la ad zman achila v'hadar avid le Mariko Shtifa. The Torah places the word achila in the pasuk of Yochal right next to Mariko Shtifa to tell me that at what point in time does the Torah require you to do Mariko Shtifa at the time of achila? The Mishnah says, Marika, Kimrika Sakos, Shtifa Sakos, Tan Rabbanon, Mariko, Shtifa Bitzonein, Divrei Rebbe. Our Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rebbe, that not only is Shtifa Bitzonein, But even marika is bitzonen, v'chachamo marika b'chamen, ushtifa bitzonen. Marika requires hot water, and then shtifa requires cold water. You rinse it off in cold water. My timer d'Rabbanan. Truth is, uh, I don't know what the Gemara is bothered by here because the Chacham are saying that which is intuitive. You want to get rid of that belia either be either before it became nosa or immediately after it became nosa. You need hot water. I mean, that's called hagola. And the Gemara answers exactly that. Right? When we took the kalim from the goyim, from Midian in booty after the Milchamas Midian, and the goyim had eaten nevelus and trefish kotzim and mosim in their keli. We have to get rid and purge that belia. How do we do so? The Torah says, "Kol asher yavo b'mayim, yavo b'mayim," means you need hot water to get rid of that belia. For Rebbe Amalchah, so how's Rebbe going to defend himself? And the answer is Hagolah Kolok Ha'imna. We're talking not about Hagolah to get rid of the Blia, to kasha the Keli. We're talking about a separate mitzvah, independent mitzvah in Kodshim called Mariku Shtifa. Ki Kamina Mariku Shtifa, the Basar Hagolah. It's after Hagolah. So somehow the Chachamim are integrating Marika and Shtifa, at least Marika, into the framework of Hagolah to get rid of the Blia. And Rebbe is talking about something totally different. He's talking about Marika Shtifa as a separate, independent obligation that has nothing to do with removing the tam of the Isa. For Abanon, in Kein Lichtov Kra O Morak, O Shotav Shotav. If you, Rebbe, are correct that Marika and Shtifa are equal, what's the difference in Marika and Shtifa? They're all the same. You're using cold water for both of them. So the Torah should have said Umarak, or the Vishutaf. The fact that the Torah uses two terms, Marika as one term and Shtifa as another, means there must be fundamentally different between the two. Mayu Morak Vishutaf. What does it mean that the Torah uses these two terms? Shma Mino Marika B'Chamen Shtifa B'Tzonen. And we're talking about the process of Gi'ule Akum. In other words, a similar process to get rid of the Blia, and that's called Marika B'Chamen. Interesting what shtifa is all about. I saw some people say that shtifa is there's like surface blia in the like the bubbles, the water on top of the kli, and we got to clean that out with rinse it off with cold water. Honestly, I don't believe that to be true. But in my mind, the Torah requires shtifa, and that's it. For 13 years, I did Hechsher Kalim in the army as part of my miluim in the IDF. I mean, don't tell the Canadians so they won't let me into the country. But anyway, we did Hechsher Kalim for Pesach. I don't even know if I can get into New York as of January, whatever. But they're taking over the whole world. So now what I did was, after every time we kasha the keli, we put in it, dipped it into cold water. That's shtifa. For Rebbe, in other words, Rebbe says that the Torah used the same term over and over again. Why? I mean, it's all bitzonein. And the answer is iksiv umarak umarak. If it would have just said the word umarak twice, hamla mina trei zimni marak, that you do marika twice. Meaning marika is the inside of the kli. You rinse out the inside of the kli once, and then you do it twice. Trei zimni shutaf. If the Torah would have repeated the word shutaf twice, then we would have come to the conclusion you have to rinse it off on the outside twice. L'kachtiv umark v'shutav lo mocha marika kimarika sakos and shtifa kishtifa sakos. Okay, now we're up to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Bishel po kodshim v'chulin. You have a kli, this very nice sized pot, and you cook in it both kodshim and chulin simultaneously. And now you're going to have to take on all the dinim of kodshim with regard to that chulin. The chulin now loses its identity halachically as chulin, and now it takes on the identity as kodshim because it's bolea, the tam of the kodshim from the pot. Another example of this is kodshim and kodshim kalim. Right, let's say you cook in one pot the basar of chatas with the basar of shlomim. Now the basar shlomim, as a result of the blia, takes on all the chumras of kodshei kodshim. So, for example, I mean, just to throw out one idea, Kodshe Kalim could be eaten by non-Kohanim, whereas Kodshe Kodshim is only eaten by Zichrei Kahuna. And now the Kodshim Kalim take on the personality, so to speak, of Kodshe Kodshim because they were bolei the time in that pot of Kodshe Kodshim. Now, all of this that we discussed, where the kal, meaning the more lenient one, takes on all the stringencies of the more chomer, the more of the more stringent one. That's only beno saint tam, yeshba beno saint tam, which means that there's a ratio of the chamur to the kal of more than 1 to 60. So let's say you have 1.0
Right.
against 60.
Mhm.
That's called beno saint tam. And harei akalim nechalim kilchamurim shebehem. Vein tuunim meruku. Oh, but we're not going to go as far as to require mariku shtifa. Now, why don't we require mariku shtifa? The kachim kalim that was cooked together with the kachim kachim have to be eaten within the time period allotted for kachim kachim. I don't know why I forgot about that, meaning 1 day instead of 2 days. And then the purging and rinsing of the pot need not be done until the time originally allotted for the kachim kolim expires. We'll have to figure this out. The Gemara is going to talk about this. The ein poslim b'maga. Right, we have what's called tumas maga, and somehow, even though the chulin came in direct contact with the kachim, nevertheless, if let's say the kachim were kachim psulim, that psul does not get, by osmosis through contagion, it doesn't affect the chulin, and we'll have to see why. Rokik shenokak berokik, shenoga berokik. So now we're talking about a soft mincha wafer, and it touched another wafer, but one wafer was kosher for karba mincha, the other was disqualified, was pasul. And now what we're going to say is that if the kosher absorbs the tam of the pasul, we have to get rid of it. We can't eat it because you're not allowed to eat kodshim psulim. And now the kodshim ksherim has absorbed the taste of the kodshim psulim. V'chaticha b'chaticha. Now here I think we're talking about chulin. Let's see if I'm right. 1 second. No. Let's say rokik shenokik berokik. That's already in menachos, and now chaticha is regard to basar kodshim, and the basar kodshim that were kosher absorbed the taste of basar kodshim shenifsalu, which were disqualified. Lo kol rakikim, lo kol chatisa surim eno aser el b'makom shebola. So if we can identify the exact place where the chulin was bolea or the kachim kalim were bolea, that is where these dinim will apply. And we don't have to assume that they spread throughout the entire kli, and even though the absorption took place in one specific area of the kli, nevertheless it spreads throughout the kli. That we don't have to say. And again, the Gemara is going to fight this tooth and nail. My ka'ama, what does the Mishnah mean when it says that you don't require mariku shtifa with regard to the kachim kalim, which absorb the taste of the chatas? The chatas generates a chiyuv of mariku shtifa. So the Gemara reformulates the Mishnah. Im yesh bahen b'nosei tamarei akalin nechalim kichamurim u'tu'urim mariku shtifa. Pom faked. If there is the sinas tam, then that basar which absorbed the tam now gives off the tam into the walls of the kli. The walls of the kli need mariku shtifa. And behem tam, if let's say there was a ratio of minus a little bit minus 1 to 60, then in such a case, none of the chumras of the machmir of the stringent basar, let's say chatas or whatever it might be, it's possible. None of those are imparted onto the heter, onto the kula, because there's no nesinas tam. Okay. The Gemara raised the following question. Nehi de kodshe kodshim. Lo bo. Yeah, there's no requirement of Mariku Shtifa in Kodshim Kalim, but in this case, Kodshim Kalim Niboy, we should require Mariku Shtifa because it absorbed the taste of the Kodshim. Omar Abaye, my ain to unim dika Omar. What does it mean that they don't require Mariku Shtifa? Kodshim, have a Kodshim Kalim to unim. Ah, so we're going now with that svara that the machayev of Mariku Shtifa is the tam of nosar when you pass the allotted time, either before or after, as we said before. So now what happens is that as far as Kodshim Kalim is concerned, he has another extra day of achila. And therefore, the requirement of Mariku Shtifa will only take place or take effect, I should say, and it only is generated when the allotted time for the Kodshim Kalim passes. So when it says Ein Te'unim, it means let's wait another day. My Rava has an alternative explanation. Ha mani Rabbi Shimoni do Amar Kodshim Kalim Ein Te'unim Riko Shtifa. So the way we understood it to begin with, that Rabbi Shimon is the one who says that the requirement of Mariku Shtifa only applies to Kodshim. And therefore, Kodshim Kalim Einam Te'unim Mariku Shtifa. So Gemara says, Bishleim el Rava hainu diktani o Kodshim v'Kodshim Kalim. The Mishnah has two cases here. It has Kodshim and it has Kodshim Kalim. To teach me that even in the case of Kodshim Kalim, even within a very strict time period, but nevertheless you don't require Mariku Shtifa because we're going according to Rav Shimon. Elabai tarti lomali. Why the Mishnah have to give me the same thing over and over again? O Kodshim, O Kodshim Kalim. And both of them have the same din, and they both generate a chiyuv of Mariku Shtifa, because we're not going like Rav Shimon. So the Gemara says, Trichi. Abai says that I can justify why the Mishnah had to be so long-winded to eat Tana Kodshim v'chulin if it wouldn't have mentioned Kodshim Kalim that were cooked together in a pot with Kodshim, but only had mentioned chulin. Havamina chulinu de mevatle Kodshim de lav minayu. When do we apply the din of bittul, which means Eino Benosein Tam? That's only when you have a struggle between two minim. For example, Kodshim and Chulin. So the Chulin, through the process of bittul of, let's say, 1 in 60, will be Mavatal the Tam of the Kodshim. I would have thought that if it's Kodshim and Kodshim Kalim, let's say Chatas and Shlom were cooked in the same pot, in such a case, there's no such din as Nesinas Tam. I'm sorry, there's no such such thing as bittul of nesinas tam, lo. Maybe the kochim kalim do not have the power, even if they are 60-1, to be mavatel the kochim v'itana kochim kalim. And why do you have to add the case of chulin? Hava mina kochim dalim elevitule kochim. If you have kodshim, it has the power to be mavatel kodshim. Aval chulin and emelo chulin cannot be mavatel kodshim tzricha. If I need both. The Mishnah says rakik shehigia berakik. Right, you have a carbon mincha psula, and it came in contact with a mincha kshera. And we said that the mincha kshera doesn't become possible, just that point of contact. We isolate that point of contact, and that becomes possible, but not the rest of the carbon mincha, or the rest of the rakik, I should say. Tan Rabbanu kol asher yiga, yachal afilu b'lo bola. With regard to the carbon chatos, it says kol asher yiga b'bisar yikdash. So if we focus exclusively on the word yiga, it might imply afilu bola, that all the chumras of the chatos are going to now apply to the shlomim simply by virtue of negia, of contact, without even bishul, without bliya. Tamiloma bibsara. So it says kol asher yiga, but then it adds the word bibsara to teach me that there's got to be more than just ki yiga. There's got to be a bliya. And now we're up to Daf Sadi Zayin Amid Beis. Ad sheyivla bibsara, yochal noga b'miktsas chaticha yekulo posel. Now, I might think that if there was a maga of, let's say, chatos with shlomim, then I might think that the impact of that maga is not limited to that particular, slice of meat of the carbon shlom, but rather it spreads throughout the entire piece of meat. And yehei kula posel. So we don't just disqualify that part which came in contact with the shlomim, but rather we assume yiga. I'm sorry, we don't say that the maga will impact the entire basar, but rather yiga. Yiga means that place where it came in contact. Hanogea posel. Ha ketzad. Choteches mokom shebola. All he has to do is cut off the place where the kochim kalim absorb the taste of the chatos, and the rest of the carbon shlomim remains kosher. Bibsara, v'lo begidin, v'lo bekarnayim, v'lo betlafayim. These dinim that the Torah specifies, that kol sheyiga b'bsar yikdash, that only applies to the basar itself, but not to the gidim, like the sinews. Lo batzovas, not to the bones. Lo b'karnaim, not to the horns. Lo b'tlofim, to the hooves. Yigdash lios kamo. So if the chatos comes in contact with the basar, and that's called a maga, then the basar gets the status of the chatos transferred over to it. HaKetzad, what does it mean, the status of the korban chatos? Im psulei tipasa. So the korban now that receives this touch, this contact from a chatas psula, that korban becomes possible. Im ksherahi, but if the chatas itself is still kshera, te'achel kechomer sheba. Right, you eat it based on the more strict laws. For example, let's say a piece of shlomim absorbed chatos fats. There are two kinds of offering within the shlomim piece. The shlom itself and the chatos that it absorbed. The shlomim piece may now be eaten, but only according to the more strict of the two meaning of the chatos. It can only be eaten for one day and one night. And there are other laws which are more chamur in chatos than in shlomim. The chatos has to be eaten by kohen zichrei kuna in the azara. Shlomim could be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. It's kodesh kalim, and it could be eaten by anyone. It doesn't have to be a kohen. Chatos can only be eaten on the very day of its shechita. Shlomim can be eaten the following day as well. When a shlomim absorbs from a chatos, the shlomim is in several respects has acquired the stringencies of the chatos. So it can only be eaten in the azara, it can only be eaten by male kohanim. It can't be eaten outside the azara in Yerushalayim. It can only be eaten on the day of its shechita, not tomorrow. But there's one chumrah in shlomim. If the shlomim is slaughtered a day earlier than the chatos, okay, let's say, for example, the shlomim was slaughtered on Sunday. The chatos was slaughtered on Monday. So now the chatos in and of itself could be eaten on Monday night, because the day and the night that follows. But that night is 2 days and one night following the shechit of the shlomim. So it's beyond the point that you're allowed to eat the shlomim. And now it becomes nosar. And the flip side is that we take the chumras of the chatos, which means you can't eat it outside the azara, you can't eat it if you're not a male kohen, and we're going to superimpose that onto the shlomim. So there'll be a psul yotze if you take the basar shlomim now outside of the azara. And again, as we said before, a non-kohen is not allowed to eat the basar. If one of the two, either the chatas or the shlomim, are possible, then the meat becomes prohibited. And that's going to lead to the next Gemara about Esei Dochelosa, but it's a doozy of a sugya. So we'll leave that for another time. And I'll leave you the end of Chanukah, Freilich Chanukah, and Chodesh Tov.
Yeah, me too.
Great, all the best.